First of all, how do you view Paris Agreement now when President Trump has shown that he has a different view on climate change problem than the EU does? And how can it work if one of the biggest polluters doesn't accept the rules of the game?
Sure. I mean, it's of course a difficult question. First of all, the climate agreement was a watershed moment. It was a moment where basically all the countries in the world came together and agreed that they want to move on climate change in a quite rapid way, meaning each country in a way committed to transform the economies. But as you said, with some nations in the world not really moving or even going backwards like the US, it's very challenging. So first of all, I think the EU is the player that can lead by example, so really showing how can you build a competitive economy in the long term, so maintain the jobs, for example, but still have kind of an economy which is not based on carbon anymore. And I think for now with the US you have to work with kind of the more progressive coalition, so there's still a lot of people who work on climate and climate change. You have businesses, you have some states, you have a lot of cities. City of New York is one good example. And I think you have to work with them for now, but then also working on a long-term common strategy, because it can only work together. And I mean, I think a second term for Trump will clearly be a big problem, but the hope would be with the next US government to be more ambitious on climate change again.
If we look at the EU, as you mentioned, leading role for it, do you think that in the near future the zero emissions economy is possible? Although it's on the paper, but do you think it can be done in the next decades coming?
It has to be done. It is a big challenge. I think for now we know what to do in some sectors. We know, for example, what to do in energy. We have to move to renewables. We know to some extent what we have to do in transport and mobility. We, for example, have to move to more e-mobility, public transport. So we have a lot of the technologies, and they're also often cheap enough already, but it's to some extent a political and social problem. So we have to see that this transition is in a fair way, and that people actually believe that it's also good for them to move to this new net zero economy. So I think it's a lot about giving a good framework and making the right investments now. And the EU is a very important player there. With the EU budget, for example, it plays a big role for the public investment in many countries. And we have to see that this money is really invested in a good way, not contradicting the climate goals, for example, but also otherwise a lot of the EU players, the European Investment Bank, for example, it all has to be aligned to trigger basically private investments with the public investment and the potential the EU has.
The EU has to work on the next big budget soon, and climate change is one of the hot topics, but at the same time we have countries, especially in this part of Europe, where many people feel that to fight against climate change it might be a priority, but you know, the budget cannot be done based on climate change rather than cohesion and other things which people feel as more imminent and more threatful to their living. How do you balance these things in your opinion? How do you explain people that this is really a priority?
So I think one element the EU budget has to show is that these two elements can go together. So basically a long-term sustainable development, economic growth for a region goes together with sustainable or green investments. And this is why it's so important at the moment that in the EU budget there is an element on just transition, this is called. So thinking around how a transition to a low-carbon economy can be just for the people, and especially the regions which are most affected. So for example, regions dependent on gas or oil or coal. And I think there we have to be really smart about long-term strategies. And I guess political decision makers have to prove that this creates jobs, that this creates prosperity for all parts of Europe and not only for some center part of Europe.
Mm-hmm. Your country, Germany, has a leading role in fighting climate change, one would argue. How successful is the German policy towards climate change, in your opinion, given the fact that it can be quite expensive, it can get quite expensive?
Yeah, I would say there are two sides to this story. The one is the energy transition was very successful in integrating renewables in the energy mix. We are now close to 40% of the power mix are based on renewables in one of the major industrial countries of Europe, which is clearly an achievement. Where Germany failed, I think, is to push out the more dirty fossil fuels out of the energy mix, like coal. So basically, Germany is one of the last Western European countries which is still, with the economy still based to some extent on coal. And I think this is the big challenge for the country in the next years. Also to cut emissions, because Germany, while being seen as a leader on fighting climate change, is not meeting its own emission reduction targets at the moment. And for Germany to play its role in the future, a climate leadership role, it has to cut emissions, and the first step is coal, but also the transport sector and in the building sector. Germany has to get much smarter about how to invest the money, because it's true, the energy transition was quite expensive for Germany. It helped to bring down prices also for other countries on renewables, and something similar should happen also for other technologies like batteries, for example.
And if we look at the neighboring countries, we see that there are quite different approaches, and we see there's a heavy reliance on nuclear energy in France, which is something Germany is not willing to engage anymore. How do you develop a common EU policy towards this if we look how different the member states are?
I think what is most important, we have a common goal, and this is cutting emissions basically to zero as soon as possible and before 2050. And there are very different ways of...
So nuclear is fine, in your opinion, in that sense?
It's not fine, but it will play a role in some countries. So I think it's domestic debates, and the domestic decision makers have to decide on this. For Germany, I think it was the right decision to phase out nuclear. There was this moment, and I do not think that nuclear is a good solution. It's economically not competitive. It's very dangerous in the long term. It has low emissions, that's the advantage, that's why it's used as a solution. But I believe an economy based on 100% renewables, decentralized, where a lot of people have ownership, prosumers, is the much better way of doing it. But it always depends on the countries. For example, it also depends on the potential for some renewable energies. Is it hydro in some countries, which is also a hot debate? Is it solar, is it wind? And for some, nuclear will very likely play a role. But of course, I would wish that this is more going towards renewables. And I mean, France is making some steps, not very fast steps, but some steps also to move away from nuclear.
So 100% zero emission economy, when in the best case scenario do you think it could be done in countries like Germany? Or I would presume that in smaller countries, if everything's being done correctly, it could be even faster.
So yeah, it depends on the country. You're right. I think in Germany we have a goal of reaching 65% renewables in the power mix by 2030. I think 100% renewables by 2040 is perfectly possible if major investments are made now. It would also create a lot of jobs. It's also important to look into the other sectors, though, where renewables have a much lower share, in the heating and building sector, for example, in the transport sector, where it's much more challenging for Germany. I think for other countries, I mean, we have some countries with great potential. Think about Southern Europe, only the solar potential. Some countries with access to the sea, like Latvia, with a lot of wind potential. So I think you always have to look to the country, and it will be a different mix. But for all of them, if like investments are made now, like for the long term, it will create jobs, and it will make it possible that 100% renewables are reached before 2050, because we have the technology.
Okay, thank you so much for the interview.
All right.
Thank you.